Well, I'm about 4 months late in reviewing Tar. If you're watching this video many years in the future, then forget I said that. Since people keep asking me about this movie, and since I have seen it, I figured I might as well get my thoughts on tape, mainly so I don't have to keep responding to people who ask me about it in person. I can just tell them to watch this video. So, hello, if you're coming to the video from a direct personal referral from me, and hello to everyone else as well. Tar, I think, is an admirable attempt at being a real movie. It starts out with a long credit sequence with tiny theater-sized font you could never read on your little cell phone. Then it gives us a long scene with long shots and long answers to a lot of long questions. This is a movie that expects you to take it seriously from the start, and I'm all for that. It's nice to see people making serious movies. Now, if you went out today to try and buy a cassette player, I'm sure you have a massive cassette tape collection. So if you wanted to buy a cassette player, you might actually have some trouble. You won't be able to get a new one that is any good because nobody makes high quality tape heads anymore. You might think that in 2023, we'd be better than ever at making stuff, but some things just fall out of favor. And in some ways, these sophisticated high modernist films maybe have gone the way of the tape deck. Is it possible that we're just a little bit out of practice making them? What about watching them? I say that Tar is an admirable attempt because I mainly see it as a missed opportunity, I guess. Which is not to say that it's bad. It's actually quite good. These days, only a couple of serious films get made each year, though, that get any kind of, serious exposure. And it's a huge undertaking to make one. It's a lot of work to convince a studio to invest in a film that does not have a guaranteed return. For all the effort that went into making this movie, for all the stars that had to align, both metaphorically and in terms of the actors, and for all of the commitment that's expected from the audience, I think Tar falls a little bit short. Even the little pieces, even the slivers of the film that I've mentioned already, have some little flaws in them. Before we get to the dignified opening credits, for instance, we have this little scene of some kind of live stream. This isn't a big deal, I guess, but for me, it was a bit of a red flag. 0 seconds into the movie, and I thought, is Todd Field going to try and say some things about the internet? That's a little worrying. Obviously, very important to keep an open mind when watching a movie, but a little worrying. I couldn't really tell what service they were trying to portray here. It's like a live video, but it's also a direct message chat thing. Not sure. Now, I do live under a rock, to be clear, so it's possible this is a real thing, but I'm not familiar with it. We actually are going to see the same service later on in the film, too, although it's not really clear why. I guess Todd Field is offering a comment on the internet. There are some other more explicit ideas about the internet, about streaming, about music distribution, about virality. But this angle, this little app they have, I don't know, to me it felt like someone trying a bit too hard to have a light touch. And the thread doesn't really seem to go much of anywhere. And I think there's actually a lot of elements in this film that can be described with those two things, trying a bit too hard to have a light touch and not really going anywhere. After the credits, we hear an introduction of Lydia Tar, who is apparently the most accomplished person ever, an EGOT. She lived in the jungle for 5 years. We're not talking about the Peace Corps here. We're talking about 5 years in the Amazon, not working for Amazon, but living in the rainforest. That is Fitzcarraldo territory. I'm not even sure if that's impressive at that point or just kind of strange. Now, I think that they overcooked the resume here. Would the movie be any different if she was not an EGOT? I don't think it really adds anything. Do they really need to explain what an EGOT is to an audience at Lincoln Center? Do they really need to give some examples of other ones? I don't know. I think the resume is a distraction. It feels like exposition, and it's written a little strangely. And it's also just kind of at odds with the tone of the rest of the movie, which is fairly understated. Now, I think some of the trailers for the film use this scene, and I almost wonder if it was forced into the movie for marketing purposes, or because producers thought that an audience wouldn't understand the movie otherwise. I don't know. The introduction here leads to an interview. This interview is conducted by Adam Gopnik, who is played by Adam Gopnik, who's actually played by Adam Gopnik, who is played by Daniel Day-Lewis, who is actually a reporter for The New Yorker in real life. and he does a good job at playing himself, I think. Playing himself in the good sense, not in the pejorative. But again, the writing in this interview, I think, feels a little weird. The interview jumps around a lot. It almost feels as if we're trying to get an abridged version of the interview, except that it's not abridged. It's still quite long. I guess it's shorter than, a real hour with Lydia Tarr at Lincoln Center might be. But it's edited kind of as one continuous scene, with Gopnik just jumping kind of from one subject to another. Sometimes he seems like an expert. Sometimes he seems like an outsider. I'm nitpicking here, but I guess if you're going to start your big movie with a really long scene that demands all this focus, it should probably be a good scene. Now, I do think the interview sets up a number of things in the movie, and I think it is crucial to the film in some ways, but overall, it feels a little bit overdone. When watching this opening scene, I guess I was thinking about a completely different movie, actually. I was thinking about the opening scene to the film Certified Copy by Abbas Kiarostami, who, to be honest, is probably a far superior director to Todd Field. I have a video where I walk through that film and the subtleties of the brilliant opening scene. That's kind of another case of a double introduction where an author comes to give a talk, and the audience of the talk and the audience of the film kind of blend together. Actually, in that movie, the author is late to the talk, so the movie starts with nothing happening, with a bunch of people waiting for it to start. A classic Kiarostami trick, starting a movie with people waiting for it to start. When the author finally shows up, he jumps into his talk, and at first you might think, well, this is a sophisticated movie, and here's a guy talking about philosophical stuff. I should probably write this down. It must be important. It must be the moral of the story. As things go on, though, you start to see the audience fidgeting a bit. And not only do they get a bit tired of listening, but the film itself starts to lose focus. It cuts away from the talk to show us all these little storylines emerging in the audience. Kiarostami very slyly undermines the philosophizing of the author and partly recasts him, not as the moral of the story, but as a guy who likes to hear the sound of his own voice. Now, in Tar, we don't see the audience in the Lincoln Center, really, and Todd Field doesn't seem particularly in tune with the attention of the audience in the theater. I could literally see people in the theater near me beginning to regret that they had come to the movie during this interview. But I do think that there is a somewhat similar ambivalence to the opening in Tar, and I think it's important maybe to see this. Again, you might be tempted to think, well, hey, look, it's a famous conductor, lived in the jungle for 5 years, so let's listen to what she's saying. This is the wisdom of the movie. Let's write this down. But I think that's a bit of a mistake. Thematically, this interview introduces us to a lot of ideas in the movie, but if anything, the answers that Lydia Tarr gives, I think, are a foil for what's going to happen. It's funny, I feel like it's not appropriate to call her only by her first name, but consider the question, for instance, about women conductors. Tarr gives a sophisticated but inconsistent answer to it. She says that women conductors have it good, that they have nothing to complain about, basically. But then she cites a sad example of a conductor who was overlooked. When talking about Mahler, she alludes to another kind of sad example. You just get the sense that this idea that there's nothing to worry about isn't going to stand the test of the time, that it might be unraveled by the film itself. And this is interesting because we've got this character who is ostensibly very wise, but there are maybe some little fractures in her thinking, and it's possible that they're really going to grow. There's also a question about how to understand the historical context of a musical work, how to understand the legacy of music, of composers. And Tarr gives another ostensibly refined answer. But again, we're going to see that things are a lot more complicated. Now, in general, I don't think the beginning of the movie is very strong, but there are some important dynamics here. And I think if you pick up on how it sets the table, then I think the rest of the movie comes into focus much more and feels a little bit less aimless. It's also a good introduction to a great character. It's hard to think of another character in a recent film, honestly, that is as complete as Lydia Tarr. Now, a lot of people have made sense of Tar as a morality play, a movie about cancel culture. To me, it's a mistake to look for anything too didactic here. In the first wave of films about a social justice issue, we tend to get pretty clear-cut stories. We get characters that can easily be divided into groups. Here are the marginalized people. Here are the exploitative people, the good guys, the bad guys, whatever. There might be some counterpoints, but usually in these films, you end with a fairly firm moral. And usually, I don't watch movies like that, to be honest. In Tar, the characters are a little bit trickier, and the film's allegiances are not so obvious. And I think in some ways, this is a fitting film for 2023/2022 when it came out, where so-called cancel culture is no longer a new thing, and where most people, no matter what they think about identity politics, have probably come face-to-face with some kind of nuance and some kind of uncertainty. Lydia Tar is an interesting character. She's many different things. In some ways, very progressive. A lesbian, a trailblazer, but also caught up in a lot of wealth and elitism that surrounds classical music. She's a powerful woman, an artist, remember, someone who has dedicated her life to art, a borderline girl boss, a role model. She doesn't want to say that women conductors face challenges. That probably would seem like weakness to her, and she's not weak. She's very strong. She also spends a lot of time trying to keep herself clean. Despite being a creative professional, she has an austere life. She is strict with herself. She's tense. And there are some darker moments, too, like when she confronts a child at the playground. She introduces herself as Petra's father, which is interesting, almost an empowering little gender play there, but she goes on to threaten this kid, which is a fairly unhinged thing to do. Why is the scene even in the movie? I think it belies a little bit of unevenness of tone in this film, to be honest. But I think that scene, that moment, is the most obvious signpost that Lydia Tar isn't a straightforward protagonist. If you're watching the movie and thinking, oh yeah, this is great, Tar is great, I can't wait to see her directing, conducting Mahler's Fifth, I hope she doesn't have a downfall. I think you goofed, if that's your view of the film. The interview hints at this, but it's a bit subtle. Her confrontation with the child is a more obvious clue. Now, the point is not that she was mean to a kid, so she should be canceled, but undeniably, this is a person with some flaws, I guess. Maybe there are some people who are viewing this movie as a parable about cancellation, where this great woman is dragged through the mud. And, you could interpret that in two ways. You might see that and think, hey, this is great. It's telling it like it is. It's finally shutting down cancel culture or whatever. On the other hand, you might see it like this and think, hey, this is terrible. It's regressive. It's contrived nonsense because it doesn't acknowledge the, important motives behind, social activism or something like that. I think in both cases, people are treating the movie as something that it isn't exactly. Now, having said that, there are some moralistic parts. The scene in the classroom, for instance, in which Lydia Tar makes a big statement about how artists should be separated from their work. And this is somewhat matches some of her statements about Mahler in the beginning. This scene starts to feel pretty moralistic. There's a question about how to understand art and historical context. It runs throughout the film. How to understand time. These are philosophical questions, and the movie contains some philosophical thought about them, but I don't think we're exactly supposed to take what Tar says at any point as exactly the final word. As much, not so much as the final word, but as something that, an example of the sort of things people might say to try to make sense of things. That's a very common move, by the way, when I'm trying to be more generous to a film, is to say, well, no, the things the characters say in the movie that may or may not be particularly rigorous, those are not the moral. Those are just an example of people trying to grapple with a situation. And I think in many good movies that is the case, and I think it's the case in this movie, but I wouldn't bet my life on it anyway. In the classroom, Tar offers some off-the-cuff remarks on this subject. She uses some big words, but there isn't really philosophical rigor to it, I think. In some ways, this classroom scene is an extension of the interview, but it tries to bring in some more elements as well. And like I said, I wasn't really a big fan. Certainly the scene isn't subtle. Now, I've actually been in plenty of college classes where there's tension between students and professor regarding changes in pedagogy, theory, culture, politics, whatever. It's pretty common. Professors, they tend to be old. I don't think it's very common to have this kind of confrontation, though. There's a bit of an idea in the news, maybe, that academic life is politically fractious these days, that there are huge divides that are undermining educations, that college campuses are just, the protests all the time, and nobody's learning anything or getting anything done. And I think this is a little bit unfair. Sure, there is a lot of activism on campus, but when you go into a classroom, you are usually talking about pretty esoteric stuff. A lot of it does not map, obviously, onto whatever political debates are in the mainstream at the time. A lot of lessons in a real college class do not lend themselves so easily to sloganeering. Things are nuanced, and a lot of professors are well aware, of course, that their students may see things in different ways. They're not naive, even if they might be a little bit grumpy sometimes about certain new ideas. Sometimes there's tension, but I really don't think direct confrontation like this is very common, at least not at good schools. Tar is giving a lesson at Juilliard, and frankly, it's not a good lesson that she's giving. A student is working through a particular composition, and rather than offering much direct technical help or specific advice, Lydia Tarr is going to shoot from the hip for a bit. Not that uncommon also, I guess. And just kind of offer her thoughts on the state of music, education, and culture in general. Professors might do this from time to time, but it's not really what you're paying money for if you're at Juilliard, I think. And it isn't great teaching, honestly. That said, this is a fine thing to put in the movie. In fact, it might be exactly the sort of thing that Lydia Tarr would do. She isn't a professor, after all. But I think the movie is hurt a bit by how unsubtle some of her comments are, and things get a lot worse when the student starts speaking up. And it seems like he is almost being played for laughs, a walking stereotype in the way he trots out various terminology. This is one of the least subtle scenes in the movie, and this scene alone almost sabotages everything I was saying earlier about this not being a didactic film. We get dangerously close to moralism here, dangerously close, and it gets worse when the video from this scene is recut as some kind of scandalous tape, somehow featuring multiple angles, somehow with a reverse shot in it. That moment was probably my least favorite part of the film. Honestly, it feels a bit like an episode of The Simpsons and not one of the good ones. I think there's room in the movie for Tar to teach at Juilliard and run into a bunch of young minds with emerging ideas. I think that would be a great scene, very interesting. But this ain't it. Todd Field just leans on a bunch of stereotypes and ends up seeming like he hasn't been to a college campus for several decades. Having said all that, I do think the movie just barely survives and avoids the moniker of a morality play. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some technical things. Cinematography, good, but kind of just what you would expect from this sort of movie and nothing more. In fact, I was a little bit underwhelmed by it. I don't know if it was the theater I saw it in, but a lot of the scenes seemed a bit dark to me. Don't know. The music is fine. Acting, generally, very strong. One of the better parts of the movie. I think that Sharon and Francesca and Olga were great, extremely strong characters with tons of depth. Really well portrayed, extremely subtle. Sharon in particular, seeing her sort of the emotional work that she puts in behind the scenes in the film is really cool. The movie could easily have been about any of one of those characters. Olga and Francesca in particular, actually, in some ways it would be more conventional to have the movie be about them, with Tar as kind of the some sort of foil or whatever. All the supporting people around the orchestra are also great. It can be hard to make a movie about music because actors got to play instruments. But here, it's really pretty convincing. I think they had a lot of real musicians. There are never really any conspicuous moments where you don't see people's hands or anything like that, except maybe a couple times, like in the classroom scene when Tar is playing the piano and limits herself to very simple things. It sticks out a little bit, but generally speaking, they do about as good of a job as you can. I think a great movie about music is the film Running on Empty, where River Phoenix is a very convincing piano player. Another interesting one is the Eddie Dutchin story. Some very convincing actors playing the piano in that movie too. Anyway, another angle on this music stuff, though, is that conducting, is a very technical thing, and it's hard to make movies about technical stuff that will also make sense to an audience. I think this movie does an okay job at that, but there's a few places where it feels like we're getting a made-for-TV version of conducting, like when Mark Strong's character, who has an inexplicable haircut, frankly, when he's begging Lydia Tarr to let him see her conductor's score or whatever, as if it's some kind of cheat sheet that will unlock true music and beauty the moment he looks at it. Seemed a bit weird. I don't think any real conductor would act like that. And really the whole plot line regarding what happens to that score is pretty undercooked. I don't quite understand what's going on there. In general, I think there's a lot of things in this movie that are fine, but don't quite hold up or are just a little bit hard to believe. I'm going to mention a few spoilers here. You know, the whole plot line of Olga getting into the orchestra. Apparently, Lydia Tarr sees Olga in the bathroom, recognizes her shoes during a blind audition, and this momentary glance in the bathroom, including a bizarre and hard to interpret glance under the stall, this causes her to erase her original grade. She sees the shoes, she thinks, oh. She erases, seemingly, the original grade, and apparently doing that is enough to get Olga into the orchestra. I guess the grades happened to be that, oh, look, it's just me changing my score completely shifts the outcome. That seems a little far-fetched. I don't know. Now, I thought that Olga and Tarr have great chemistry in the movie. Really, really nice scenes together and a very interesting relationship. But some of the mechanics behind this plot line are just a little weak. The way that Tarr just sort of subtly convinces everyone that they should have auditions and all this stuff, and nobody really seems... Maybe part of the idea is that nobody wants to call her out or nobody wants to say anything about it. But like I said, there's a few pieces here that just feel a little bit outlandish, and a lot of the plot is like that. Now, granted, this is not necessarily a movie that it's not necessarily a thriller where the details really count. The big ideas are more important, I guess, but still, if you look at great movies, great films, they usually don't have tons of issues like this. And Tarr really has a lot of kind of confusing errata here and there, things that don't quite add up. Returning to style, one thing that's interesting about this film is that it uses symbolism from time to time. This was a little bit surprising to me, actually, because for the most part, this feels like a rigorously realist film, almost mirroring the austerity that Tarr has. But then we get to the scene with the metronome, implying, I guess, some old secret, a ticking time bomb locked away in this closet. Or there's the shot of Tarr on a bed in the middle of a pond, and, oh, the bed's on fire. I guess she's feeling isolated, under attack. I don't think these moments were particularly necessary, but I guess they're fine. This movie reminds me of some of Michael Haneke's films, Amour, for instance, or Cachet, and probably The Piano Teacher, which I have seen, but it was so long ago. I was probably a bit too young to watch that movie, and I can't really make any real comparisons there. Haneke has always done a great job at mixing the real and the imagined, and I don't think Todd Field does quite as good of a job at that. Really, we could have just cut the symbolism out, but I guess maybe it's, I don't know. I'm sort of on the fence here. I do think the movie has nice dynamics, as in the beginning, as I've already mentioned, is kind of boring, but things do heat up. Things start going wrong. There's more tensions. The fractures, like I said, start to show a little bit. The claims made in the beginning start to be tested. We see how pressure shifts people around and their relationships, and really, things go farther than I had expected. We see people having to face quite big changes in their life and in their heads as well. The climax of the film is a bit odd, to be honest. I guess it's fine, but it's a bit odd, I'll just say. I guess it's filmed and edited in a way to sort of be surprising. I don't know. I like the ending, though. I'll come back to that. I do like the ending. There's some iffy technological moments in this film. I already mentioned the weird app that they feature. It didn't really make sense to me. The contrived video with the impossible angles, playing full screen on this phone and such. There is also a scene where Lydia Tarr deletes all of her sent emails. Take a tip from a professional security researcher. That's me. Deleting your sent emails does nothing. It won't clear you of legal liability. It won't keep authorities from being able to read the messages. Now, it might keep your significant other or someone else who shares your laptop from seeing what you sent if they look through your sent mail, but that's about it. Maybe Tarr is supposed to seem like a bit of a boomer in this scene, but later events seem to suggest that the strategy actually works, as in the emails are never part of the legal proceedings in the movie. So it's possible that Todd Field is the boomer. Again, this isn't a huge issue, but these things just kind of add up. And honestly, I think that this movie kind of feels dated, even though it came out 4 months ago, which is a shame. When I see one of these big Oscar contenders that demands my attention, I hope to get something in return that is big and that's timeless, deep. For me, Tar almost gets there on the strength of its characters alone, but not quite. And while it has the trappings of a sophisticated film, and while I do enjoy that, I don't think it seals the deal with any of the themes that it kind of brings in. It sets the table nicely, sort of. and then it puts some of these ideas through the paces, but they just don't really get anywhere. And like I said, it sometimes is, a subtle film about cancel culture and politics, but it also can't quite escape from being polemical and mechanical. It has some ideas about music and the meaning of music, how it should be understood, and I guess it leaves us with questions there, which in some ways is fine, but yeah, I just felt like it could have done more. Similarly, with some ideas about technology, what the internet is doing to classical music, it had some back and forth there. Lydia Tarr complains about YouTube and streaming and how it's decentering the conductor or whatever, but she also watches Olga's video on YouTube and is quite moved by it. So there is some stuff there, but again, it's like it just doesn't really feel like they get anywhere with it. It had some ideas about elitism as well, but again, to what end? Not sure. I also did not feel particularly emotionally engaged with this movie. The character and the film are both austere and unflinching, at least until the end. Now, honestly, I really like the end of the movie, and again, it's almost enough. It's almost enough. When Lydia Tarr's life kind of falls apart, in some ways I think it opens up. I really like seeing Tar return to her childhood home. She watches Bernstein on an old television. It's an interesting reminder that her hero in classical music spent a fair amount of time evangelizing classical music to general audiences. The tape of Bernstein is kind of spoon-feeding the audience. It's television. And he's kind of spoon-feeding the audience with something about the emotional power of classical music. Taken at face value, maybe this is a signal that Tar needs to get back in touch with music. Oh yeah, remember, music is about emotion or something like that. But I don't think it's quite that easy. Bernstein's antics here, to me, are a bit facile, and popular classical music is kind of at odds with what Lydia Tarr has spent her life doing. I don't think going back to Bernstein is stabilizing. Instead, I think it's uncertain. Uncertainty, my favorite thing in film and in life. And the ending of this movie is uncertain. Tarr stays on the conducting circuit because that's her job, and I guess because it's her passion. But man, it's a weird transition for her. If you've read the film as her tragic downfall, then you might see the slow revelation as the final insult. But I think the movie and the ending is much more finely balanced than that. In conducting a youth orchestra in Southeast Asia, Tarr connects with something new. At the same time, she's humbled. Somewhere deep down, I think it is rejuvenating. This is a woman, remember, who spent 5 years living in the Amazon, and then certainly many more years in a very guarded and closed classical world, having to perform a very particular role, having to deal with a lot of stresses, the stresses of gender, the stresses of elitism, of finance, the stresses of sort of this, this classical music world. In some ways, when that falls away, she can start to open up. At the same time, she sees that she won't ever be able to escape certain parts of her legacy. Here, I think the film starts to have some emotional weight. You start to feel right at the end, maybe. And in general, I think it really comes in for quite a solid landing. Okay, overall, Tar is probably better than 90% of films that came out in 2022. But does it belong on the list of great sort of modern films? I don't think so. I may watch some more Todd Field films, but with a sample size of one, I am somewhat confident in saying that he is not Stanley Kubrick or Michael Haneke or Abbas Kiarostami. Still, it is an admirable effort, and hopefully one that he'll follow up with another interesting movie. Let me leave you with an interesting little piece of trivia. This movie has Alec Baldwin in it, which is ironic, I guess. He's in a tiny role. He was also in Blue Jasmine and The Aviator, 2 movies that Cate Blanchett won Academy Awards for. So we'll see what might happen with this film.